meeting on June 18th of the Subcommittee for the Outdoor Recreation of the Task Force for 1296, the Task Force on the Rights of Coloradans with Disabilities. Want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining. Just a few quick administrative items and reminders. If you are a member of the subcommittee or of the task force, and you're in a place where it's safe, you have stable internet and you're able to do so, we'd love to have you on camera. Yep, Christina, I'm looking at you and I'm amazed you do have the stable internet. If you're a member of the public, we're thrilled that you joined us. We will have time for public comment towards the end of today's meeting at about 4:15, but we would ask that you leave your camera off right now so that members of the subcommittee and members of the task force who are joining can focus on the conversation with one another. Final two things, just as a matter of procedure and protocol. We do ask folks to avoid using the chat room. It can be distracting for the conversation for all members, and particularly for any of our members or participants who use screen readers or other adaptive technologies. And finally, I will just ask, because we are streaming on YouTube, we are recording, that when you speak, you say your name first so people know who is talking. With that, I'm going to go ahead and dive us right into the conversation. I want to set expectations and explain how we're going to be approaching these next few meetings. We have spent 5 months learning a ton, hearing from a lot of guides, from equipment manufacturers, from operators, from people with lived experience. We've tried to provide as much input and information across this broad charge we have about reducing and eliminating barriers to enjoying Colorado's outdoor recreation, which itself is this giant spectrum of opportunities. Where we are now is it's time to take all of that learning and the conversations you've had and start developing ideas that may turn into recommendations. But I want to be very clear that our goal today is not to get to recommendations that we're advancing. And it's not going to be about voting up or down on a specific idea. What we want to do is get a short set of ideas that may be 3 to 5, that may be 10 to 15, that we can then share with stakeholders across the state to get their input. And when we do that, again, we're not going to be asking stakeholders, do you like this or do you hate this? Do you vote yes or no? We want to present them with different ideas and ask them questions like, what do you see as the strengths and benefits of this type of approach? What would be your concerns or the implications you could see of this type of approach? So it's really an opportunity for you to generate what may be several parallel solutions to any one of the issues we've identified and get that stakeholder input. We're going to be relying on all of you to help us get that stakeholder input. What we will do is at the end of today, Carrie and I will take the discussion and we'll clean up that set of ideas you all have generated. We'll share them back out with you so that we make sure we capture them correctly. Then over the next 2 weeks, we will get them posted on Engage Dora, the website hosted by Dora to allow us to get stakeholder input. Once they are posted there, where there'll be an explanation of the process and an explanation of the type of input that we're seeking, we'll ask all of you to share that with as many folks as you want. We want to get as diverse of input as we can on all of these ideas, from people in the business community or the tourism and recreation industry, to people who are disability advocates, to obviously first and foremost people for whom these changes may create benefits and eliminate some of these barriers. So with that, let me also explain a little bit about how we're going to break these down, because as I said, we have covered a ton of different areas as we've talked about outdoor recreation. Today's conversation is going to focus on ski areas and what we want to do to look at removing barriers to access and enjoyment of recreation there. As we talk about that, I don't want to limit the conversation to ski areas in the winter. We know there's a lot of things that happen up there, whether that's cycling, hiking, some of their sleds or other things. So today's conversation is about the venues themselves or the locations and all sports that may take place there. As we go into our next conversation at our next meeting, we'll move on to talking about aquatic sports, water-based recreation, ranging from lakes to rivers to streams. Then we'll have another meeting with another conversation that really looks at trail-based activities, whether that's adaptive cycling, hiking, climbing, and other activities on trails and other outdoor spaces. One thing I do want to name, because we did have a number of questions and people raising ideas around transportation. We're going to look to have a separate conversation about transportation after we get through these recreation focused conversations. So today will be about ski resorts and access and enjoyment of recreation at them. Then we'll go into our next meeting about aquatic based sports. And then the final one will be trail based, excuse me, not the final. The next will be trail based, followed by transportation. In all of these, we're going to follow the same model. We're going to develop possible solutions or ideas. These aren't recommendations, they're possible ideas. We'll put those up to get stakeholder feedback on them of what folks want you to consider as you then develop the recommendations. At the next meeting, then we'll bring you the feedback on today's topic, give you the chance to digest that. And ultimately, as we go into August and September, we'll take all of the ideas you've generated, all of the stakeholder input, and we'll start then to develop the set of recommendations that you all want to vote on and advance to the executive committee. When we do put recommendations together, we will be putting in the report both a majority and minority report and opinion on these. So while I would love to see every recommendation get to unanimous consensus, we don't need that in order to advance these recommendations. We will go by majority, but where you are not in the majority, you will have the opportunity to include in the report why you didn't support that particular recommendation. With that, let me pause and see if there are any questions from our members. I'm not getting any questions right now. Jeffrey, welcome to the call. Not picking on you. We do ask that anyone who is not a member of the subcommittee leave their camera off until it's time for public comment. I appreciate that. I see a number of folks who have not been on the call or aren't members of the subcommittee. We will have time for public comment at 4:15. What I would ask is that you drop a message. This is the only time I'll ask you to use the chat to either Carrie Steele or myself, Barrick Abramson. And at that point, we will invite you in for public comment when we get to that. With that, members of the subcommittee, I'm going to go right into this conversation. I want to kind of remind and ground us in where we've talked. As I said, we had the transportation conversation. Because that is so broad and covers so many different issues, we're going to hold that for a separate conversation. So for today, we want to start the conversation about recreation at ski resorts or mountain resorts, starting with the moment that you arrive. So that may include things like equipment pickup or drop off. It may include parking. We've heard about just getting through gates or gaining entry. Obviously, we need to have a conversation about the lifts themselves. And although I don't see Rep Ortiz on yet, I know if I'm channeling him, he wants us to make sure we have a conversation about how to transport that adaptive equipment on the lifts. We heard from months ago, there's an ANSI board, that's the code board, who is developing a set of recommendations around these equipment. They expect they're probably still a year to a year and a half away from publishing those recommendations. One option for all of you to consider is what Colorado may want to do with that code. Excuse me. And to be clear, the ANSI code is not a set of requirements. It's a set of guidance. You have the option to consider recommending that the state adopt that when we get there. Melanie, I see you have a question.
It actually is incorporated in the Colorado Passenger Tramway Safety Board's
thank you.
Requirements by reference.
Okay, that's good to know, and I appreciate
Just
you
a
clarifying.
clarification.
Yeah, thank you. So with that, I'm going to start, and I'm going to kind of guide us through the outdoor rec experience continuum so that we're not jumping from parking to lifts and all over the place. I want to kind of have a path of the conversation. So my first question, and again, we're surfacing ideas, not recommendations. I'm not asking you to vote for each other's, but ideas you might want to get stakeholder reaction to in terms of solving some of the barriers you all have discussed. And let's first talk about that first phase of getting there and enjoying it. After you've arrived, you're parking, you're dropping off equipment, you're dropping off passengers. We're going to go into that discussion of what in that initial phase you think you may want to consider making recommendations. And for now, I want to keep the recommendations on the role of the state. We'll have the opportunity to talk about best practices and things going forward. But in that first aspect, from parking to arrival to entering the venue, what ideas does anybody want to put on the table for consideration? Sharon, jump in.
I'll go first. I believe I mentioned after our last conversation, just a rough search. It looked like roughly 10% of Colorado's population has some type of disability, and just making sure that parking lots represent that population that we represent here in Colorado. So 10% of all parking spots, just something rough like that. I don't know if we're meeting those numbers. I would have to follow up or reach out to someone else that has more information.
So to be clear, and I'm going to bring in Rep Ortiz in just a second. Sharon, you're suggesting that we have something, we socialize and stakeholder an idea requiring the number of accessible parking spaces at 10% is the number you're considering.
Just roughly. I mean, I don't know the stats for sure, but I had looked it up last week and I don't know how accurate Google is. So, you know, don't hold me to that.
Understood. Rep Ortiz, jump in.
Thanks. And some parks are better at this than others. Like I know Keystone, not where their adaptive sports program is, but on the other side, has plentiful parking. The issue that I noticed is that the abuse of that, right? And then, you know, start with that. The second thing too is like, I don't know what the stomach is or how we could organize this, but I really think in the future, there should be some type of adaptive athlete parking that adaptive athletes can apply separately for, because you still like, you know, for those that aren't adaptive athletes that don't have adaptive equipment, for us, it's about having a safe space to drop off our equipment, put it together, and then like park our vehicle and still get to where we need to get to in a timely manner, right? So those are the things that we need to think about. So I would think about making it so that there's a system that adaptive athletes can apply for specific adaptive athlete parking spots that are not the same as the handicap placard parking lots. Because a handicap placard is anyone, even if they're bilking the system, can park there. Like I would like there to be a specialized parking for athletes that have adaptive equipment, that need adaptive equipment, and that might dictate where it ends up going. So obviously it'd be close to where they could be setting up their equipment and leaving their equipment. So just want to put that out there again. I can't make recommendations on this task force. I can give y'all ideas, but that's something that's always on my mind.
So you're going to see Mr. Ortiz and I kind of riff back and forth on this because of the structure of the task force and the subcommittees. The members of the executive committee are not on these calls to help you develop ideas or solutions, but they certainly are here to bring their perspective, their expertise, their lived experience. And in the case of Rep Ortiz, as a passionate advocate in the legislature who has worked on a number of these issues. So when he or other members, and I know the lieutenant governor is on, and we may have others, when they offer ideas, I invite all of you to consider them. I then need to hear from one of you if that's an idea that you would like to include on our list to go socialize. Sharon, I think I saw John's hand up first. So let me get to John and then Sharon.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, on both counts. I just have a concern about implementation. First of all, with respect to Sharon's idea of 10%, I think we should be more surgical if we want to do percentage requirement, because we probably should calibrate it to usage or expected usage if we're going to implement that kind of requirement. I don't think 10% of Colorado is going to, well, I don't think an equivalent percentage of the ski community is disabled. At this point, we can leave room to grow, but I just don't think we should be as general as that. On a second note, with respect to adaptive athletes, I really like the idea that Representative Ortiz posed. The thing I would worry about is are we discriminating? We would have to be careful about drafting language to make sure that we're not discriminating against anybody on the basis of a protected class. We can do that by saying maybe like equipment parking, for example, rather than like the individual person. As for what I would recommend on this one is just I've always had trouble with like going from the parking lot to wherever the lifts are. It's very difficult for me, at least, and I'm sure other people, to manage the ice conditions. I'm often slipping in the snow and all of that. And what I would recommend is an incentive at least to ski resorts for them to offer heated parking lots and heated sidewalks. I know that that's expensive, but I've seen it happen at certain places that could be a difference maker.
Thank you, John. And John, this is not speaking to anything you said or that I've heard yet, but it's more me setting kind of the groundwork and the hope for these conversations. Number one, for today's conversation, I don't want you to yet worry about things like enforcement and compliance and how those would happen. But I want to be very clear that when we put recommendations forward, we will be asking you to weigh in on what those enforcement mechanisms and methods of compliance should be. I also would encourage you not today to worry about who may push back on any one of your ideas. There will be pushback on many ideas. My encouragement to all of you is to be aspirational, to be bold, to set that bar high, because someone is going to try to lower it as we go forward. So set the big aspirational goals now, and let's go see what the stakeholders have to say about those. And then you'll have the opportunity to intake all of that and see where you want to go with those recommendations. Let me go to Sharon and then to Jen Mendenhall.
Hi, this is Sharon. I just had a couple of thoughts. The reason why I had recommended the 10% was hopefully to curb some of the misuse of the regular disability placards. So if that's our population, it is being used or misused, then it also covers someone with a sprained ankle walking on crutches for a weekend or anything else. Representative Ortiz, I had a thought similar to yours where especially we jump through so many hoops, like having a disability. Like I have to go through so many verifications just to prove that I'm disabled. I don't know why we don't have a permanent disability placard that's somewhere presented along that process. So possibly not something that's, an athlete, because I don't know how we would label someone as an athlete or not. But I do think it's valid for not just ski resorts, but a lot of places where if I have to prove that I have a permanent disability for Social Security, all of these other things, there's no reason why I can't have a placard and kind of have priority over someone that's rolled an ankle for that weekend while hiking. So did have some thoughts on there. I know you have way more expertise diving in through all this, so I don't know if you have any ideas around that one.
Rep Ortiz, jump on in, sir.
Sure. I mean, the revamping accessible parking would be a separate conversation, right? Like this isn't the let's fix the abuse of accessible parking task force. This is about access to the outdoors. And I think even though it's obviously a part of it, the reason why I think of, at least for ski resorts, with adaptive athletes is you have to apply for your lift. Like there's a lot of different ways in the system that we can build in where, and we have people that come from other countries to train in our mountains too that want to participate. So if we create a streamlined, easy system where you are showing like different criteria, whether it's one, I have the accessible placard, like that's criteria one. Another is I have an adaptive piece of sport equipment, and then it could be as easy as sending in a photo of that. I think that there would be merit to creating a smaller subset of parking that is specific for adaptive athletes. Because here's the thing too, accessible parking isn't always closest to where the lift is. There might be some parking that's currently reserved for employees, and I'm just going to be honest, that might not necessarily need that, or some of it could be reserved for adaptive athletes that are there every day training or that are there often, that need to be able to unload their 40 to 50 pound equipment, be able to leave it safely, right? Like there's a lot, like, again, we're just being aspirational. We're talking systems that we might be able to change. I think that could be one of them, at least for ski mountains, right? Like that, because you need to have either a day pass or a season pass to ski in and of itself. Like it is different than just going hiking or going tubing down the Pooter, right? So that's why, like, even if you guys choose not to take that up, the executive committee gets to make its own recommendations. That's going to be one that I push forward. So I do like the idea of revamping accessible parking and trying to differentiate between those that are temporary, disabled, or permanent, but there's plenty that are that have the permanently disabled placard that it's a bunch of 20-year-olds having a tailgate. And again, like, I'm not trying to take away from invisible disabilities. Like all disabilities matter, but priority parking should be given to those that have a mobility device and that have adaptive equipment, because that's when it gets extremely cumbersome, right? So that's who I'm trying to think of.
Thank you, Rep. Ortiz. And I'll leave to members if you want to put something on the table relating to things like where accessible parking is located. We do have the idea that has been suggested now by a member for the adaptive athlete parking. Jen, I'm going to go to you next. And just to remind folks, we're starting kind of through the pathway of enjoying it. So we're talking about parking and then entry into the facility. Next, we're going to go into things like the lifts and how those function and using equipment. Then we'll go into the full facilities and things like buildings and other venues within them. But Jen, what are you thinking in this first part of our conversation?
Well, I guess I raised my hand and I lowered my hand because I wasn't sure that I'm on the right part of this conversation, but was looking at how the Forest Service works with the ski areas under the ADA to provide some of the things that we're talking about under Section 504 of the ADA. And part of that is kind of spelled out here about access and the Architectural Barriers Act. And that might not be part of the conversation for right now, but those were my original thought, that we have some guidelines within this already that we can make recommendations for. But I guess if we're talking about just about aspirational goals, something that came to my mind, because it is really hard to get into a parking lot. At our local ski area, they set up the disability parking things that they can move back and forth. And then after you park and you're up on the mountain, they pull those off all out of the way. And so then you might have a person that comes and parks right next to you, so you can't open your ramp, and then you can't find out where that person is to move their car. So I mean, there's ways around that. But again, the base area and getting from your car, my thought was, well, maybe we need like a team of concierges that can help. And maybe like what we use for my daughter's bi-ski is a skateboard with wheels on it that has a clip that we can lock it into. Maybe there's some way to help transport equipment, and that, there's a concierge or that's not the right word, but, just part of the ski area program that can help transport equipment if people wanted to. Obviously, some people are very independent in being able to do that on their own, but to have some sort of way to help transfer gear to other places at the base area.
Thank you, Jen. And I'm going to ask you, and you're free to answer, to punt, or to call a friend on this. My task today is to try to really surface ideas that we can go share with stakeholders to get feedback on. So I want to go to, you raised this idea of whether we call it a a concierge, an escort, or a valet of some means, and whether that's a person or that's equipment that helps, are you putting on the table, or would anyone like to, something specific that you would like the state to call for? And that could range from the state requiring that to be the place. It could be incentives. It could be a best practice that you name. But if the goal here is to put ideas on the table, what would you see as potentially the role of the state? I'm going to go to you, and then I'm going to go to John, who's got his hand up next.
Well, I think that that would be in my, just, that would be hard for the state to regulate something like that possibly, but it might be a best practice for ski areas to want to maybe, we put this great athlete parking area, and then you have a best practice type of program that helps transport people in their gear as well.
Fair enough.
Because there might be a snowbank right there that they plowed to where the sidewalk goes that you need to go to, and so you have your great parking area where you can unload, but still can you get to where you need to be?
And please understand, in these conversations, you're going to hear me asking what may seem like leading questions or may seem like kind of silly, obvious questions. It's because I want to make sure I'm capturing your thoughts accurately so we can go share these. John, did you have your hand up and it went back down?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate my final recommendation, verbal recommendation that heated services be eliminated, because I think it is a big problem for mobility challenge people.
Thank you, John. Sharon.
Yeah, I was kind of just working my way through like arriving, and then the next thing was definitely equipment. Both Rep Ortiz and Jen had mentioned it, talking about equipment to and from. I do think there should be something in place where if you have a pass or if you have maybe verified equipment, you're also given a parking sticker or pass for those equipment loading or unloading spots to show that you have verified equipment. And likewise, if you don't have an equipment, there should be some type of transportation or something provided to get you from the parking spot equipment location back to the mountain, because I have had friends that have shown up to the mountain, find out that the adaptive equipment location is somewhere else or sometimes even off mountain. So then they have to get back in their vehicle, drive to location, get equipment, then come back to the mountain. They've already wasted a good majority of their day just trying to get access to the mountain, just step one. So if we are going to have to go somewhere else for equipment, then there should be some type of shuttle or some type of access to make that portion easier. I don't think we should have to rely on someone going and getting equipment for the first time just to get to the mountain and try to figure out the whole equipment and unloading, issue that we're having for athletes or people that already do it on a regular basis. That's even a bigger hurdle for someone that's new to the mountain.
So Sharon, if you can stay with me, because I want to clarify and talk with you a little bit about what ideas we may want to socialize. I'm hearing in what you're discussing a couple of options that the state could require this adaptive athlete equipment, certified adaptive equipment drop-off or parking location that is near the actual ski lifts and entry. Or I heard you also offer the idea that if that's not available, that they provide a free shuttle service from where that parking, where you can load and unload accessible adaptive equipment is. Are those the two ideas? Am I hearing that right? And would those be two ideas you'd like to share with stakeholders?
Yes, I think it should be both because it's
Okay.
access to entry type thing. So someone that's new to the mountain, we are having to access equipment and we are having to go through that same unload process once we get to the mountain or at a parking spot. So we're kind of having to do double the work. So if it's challenging for an adaptive athlete just to park and unload their equipment, someone that's never been to the mountain is now having to go through twice the work. If you've already proven that you can access the mountain on your own and unload the equipment on your own, feel like you should have, something, whether it's that permanent disability placard or a sticker or something where you can park somewhere that has quick access to a lift, how to get on there, how to do it on your own. But someone that has not utilized equipment before and it's their first time and they need to get adaptive equipment, they need to get to an instructor, there should be some type of transportation service provided, so they're not having to go back and forth and figure that out on their first day.
Got it. Thank you for letting me clarify that with you and for workshopping that. Jen,
Hi, just one thought too about this is, and maybe Melanie could kind of give a little bit more advice about this as well. But like, I just bought our Epic passes and just signed, you know, activated them and put in the pictures and all that kind of stuff. Maybe linking your ski pass to some sort of, you know, of the valet, for lack of a better term, service, or what kind of services you would need at the base area.
Melanie, anything you want to offer since you were mentioned?
I don't off the top of my head know enough to offer you a educated response, Jen. I think it's a really interesting idea. To link information at the purchase point, not just for season passes, but if you might be buying a day ticket. And most of that is taking place online these days, and more of it will be in the future.
And that way the ski area would know, say I'm coming this day, you know, I need, the elevator needs to be working because I have, you know, that just to kind of give the ski area more information about who their clients are as well.
Thank you both. Let me go to Madison and then Curtis.
I want to build off something that Sharon said is with the equipment drop off winter and summer, there's things like bike racks and ski racks. And so maybe having specially reserved bike racks and ski racks that are near the drop off point. So X number of reserved ski racks for adaptive equipment only type of recommendation.
Got it. Thank you, Madison. Curtis.
So having a staff, I don't know if you want to call it ambassador, concierge, whatever, being proactive, you know, not somebody that's an attendant that gives out tickets or whatever, somebody that would guide and educate people there, I think would be needed. No matter what, you're going to have people that try to abuse the system. So having that someone available, I think would be a huge piece to it for it to work. I agree with the drop-off area specifically that's close. I also have to throw in the 10% estimate of folks with disabilities. I think is almost laughable. CDC, you know, it says that 27% of our population have disabilities. I can't estimate how many are, you know, have adaptive equipment that wouldn't have this need, but I think those statistics are much more reasonable, just because I think the 27% is a low number because of people who don't identify themselves necessarily as disabled. So I think that's a piece to use, the statistics. So
Curtis, I appreciate that. And we'll have to have some further conversations at this gap between 10% that Google throws out and the 25 to 27 that CDC does. I do want to follow up on one of your ideas just to make sure I'm capturing or not missing something. You talked about that ambassador or that concierge. Is the idea that the state would require every resort to have an available designated point of contact for those with disabilities to access their services and navigate them?
a little mixed feeling on that. Yes, basically. And I think you could probably combine it with other duties. You know, that just a customer service person that's going to help anyone that comes along that has issues, that would direct people.
Fair enough.
I just think it'd be good customer service, period. So,
and again, I'm not trying to lead anyone. It's just when I hear what could become an idea to socialize, I want to make sure I capture it. Rep Ortiz.
Just building off of what Curtis said. So first of all, I agree with him. If we're going to tie it to percentage, it's got to be something official. And the CDC and 10% does seem low to me. CDC says 20 to 25%. That is standard. And all of my bills, when I testify about basic access, I use the flat number of 20%. So appreciate him calling that out. The second thing is when we're talking about staff, right, just like gas stations have to send out an attendant if the person has a disability and needs to refill their car. That's kind of what this idea sounds like. I want to throw out another idea that to build or layer on that and that maybe ski resorts can work something out with their adaptive sports programs to not just give them space and have the adaptive sports programs fundraise and pay for their own people, but maybe they can partner up and spend some of their own money also contracting with these adaptive sports programs and put them on the payroll as well. And the reason why I bring this up is just this year when I was going to Winter Park, one, the elevator to the only accessible bathroom was not working. Fun times for me. NSCD was lucky enough to be open, so I got to use their accessible bathroom. So I was lucky there. But then they informed me that their office space is getting less and less and becoming smaller because the ski resorts need that space to give to ski school, which is ridiculous, right? So like any way that can tie these adaptive sports programs into being required and staffed by the resorts themselves as well, if we're going to talk about a concierge, I would be supportive of, because then it would make it harder for ski mountains to diminish and diminish and diminish the space as they feel like it.
Thanks, Rob. Sharon.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that a little bit. I do think on top of the concierge or ambassador service, it's also a safety issue and concern too. If someone's accessing the mountain with a disability, whether it's their first time or they need some help or assistance, it's also allowing us to do these activities safely. And so having someone on hand, whether it's an adaptive program or part of the ski patrol or something else, I do feel like that is almost a necessity. If someone got stuck with a disability somewhere, it's going to be a problem. It's going to probably require ski patrol and some, extra help. So just having someone on hand for those things specifically would make sense. That's also trained to handle those situations.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. Rep Ortiz.
Yeah, just to jump in here, the ski patrol is already trained on how to evacuate or extract skiers with disabilities. So I know that for a fact. Adaptive sports programs are there to help someone become independent. So you kind of are required to go through them as you begin. I mean, it's every individual's responsibility to be able to navigate the mountain, just like whether you're a leg walker or a disabled person, like you have to have the basic skills to be able to safely navigate the mountain. So, I don't see that like requiring ski patrol to go skiing with you. That I would consider that a step too far. I mean, you have your adaptive sports program, just like an able-bodied person. Like if you take the risk to get on the mountain and you don't know what you're doing and you hurt yourself, that's on you. And the way that the ADA interacts with the Architect Act of the 70s, it's a combination of building access and what the adaptive skier's ability is. That's the requirement that's on ski resorts and on the mountains. So we're here to talk about securing that access, ensuring that their adaptive ski programs in every mountain could be a part of that, according to the way federal ADA and the Architecture Act interacts. But then requiring a ski patrol person to always ski with an adaptive skier is not. That's a step too far. So just want to create clarity around there, and just also reinforce the fact that ski patrol is trained on how to evacuate individuals with disabilities, and adaptive sports programs that exist on mountains are very good at educating and training people, not just to have the skills, but how to be independent. It's ours to secure the access though. So if like ski resorts are not, when they go to the 2 manufacturers in the world that offer ski lifts and say, hey, we want to go to a 4 to an 8-pack and make it safer for kids, and they're not saying, oh, also make it accessible for adaptive ski equipment and skiers with disabilities, that's where we need to make the recommendation and step in. For example, say, hey, when you contract with these 2 manufacturers, that you must include in the contract that they also have to design with adaptive athletes or adaptive skiers in mind as well, right? Like, so that's an example.
And Rep Ortiz just opened the door for exactly where I'm going next. Rep Ortiz, I hope you will stay on camera with me. I'm going to go a little off my normal process here, and I'm going to call on the rep to offer some ideas. And then Melanie, as representative of industry here, I'm going to ask for your thoughts and ideas as well. We've talked about parking. We've talked about initial access. In a few minutes, we'll talk about things like coming down the mountain, whether on adaptive ski or cycling equipment. We'll talk about the lodge and other things like that. But we've got the first or the next step, which is getting up the mountain. And that means talking about ski lifts. We as a group, we heard about what the ANSI board is looking at, and they're a year plus away, it sounds like. But there's some conversations for all you to have to consider making recommendations on what we may want to require of those lift manufacturers or any company buying lifts and placing them into operation in Colorado. And as I said, I normally don't call out a member of the exec committee, except that Rep. Ortiz has spent a lot of time working on this. He and I have had a lot of conversation. So Rep. Ortiz, I would invite you to put ideas on the table when it comes to whether it's the chairs or the equipment to connect and transport adaptive equipment.
All right, so let's start with the chairlifts itself. Like the easy low-hanging fruit that I see is that any requests that Ski Country makes, so like when they are like, hey, when they do an order with the 2 manufacturers in the world, that in every request contract, whatever iteration that is, whether they're saying, hey, we want to go from a 4 to a 6-pack, we also want to make sure we're making it safer for kids, that they must also include in writing, citing that they must also design for the safety and use, independent use of individuals with disabilities that use adaptive sports equipment. That has to be in, because that creates a paper trail that they are actually reminding ski manufacturers that if they're going to provide those ski lifts to the U.S., where the federal ADA exists as law, and where the Architect Act of the 70s exists as law, and the Colorado anti-discrimination law exists in the state, that they need to adhere to those currently existing laws. And that puts some of the onus on ski resorts. They can't just all of a sudden say, well, they don't do the designing. Well, because you're not requesting it, right? So this is a way to mandate that they put it in writing that they are going to, as well as saying, oh, we need a 6-pack from a 4-pack, also make it safer for kids. And please remember that we have disabled skiers that use the mountain, and that it must be designed for their safety and independent use as much as possible as well.
And so let me pause it. And Rep. Ortiz, in just a second, I'm going to come back to you and talk about the equipment connections for taking it up. But do we have any members who want to pick up Mr. Ortiz's idea there and that requirement from the state and put that on a table, not for a yes or no vote, but to socialize and get stakeholder reaction? Jen, I'm seeing you nod, so we're putting that on the table. Melanie, I'm definitely going to bring you in. I have an obligation. We're probably going to end up putting parallel, sometimes competing or different solutions on the table. But since Mr. Ortiz, Rep. Ortiz had raised this, I wanted to put it to the group, and I'm seeing an interest in getting feedback on it. But Melanie, as our operator here, and since Ski Country was named, want to bring you into the conversation for your thoughts, both on what Mr. Ortiz shared, but also any ideas you want to put on the table of what role the state can play in requiring certain actions or enforcing certain things to get at this accessibility.
I want to speak generally to the issue of designing and purchasing ski lifts. Rep. Ortiz correctly noted there are a very small number of manufacturers of lifts. They are heavily engineered, and they are designed to keep people from falling out. People of all ages, sizes, abilities, disabilities, and I am going to recommend that any recommendations that our group makes about ski lifts go to the American National Standards Institute's committee, the B77 committee on ski lifts, because that is the body that has the expertise to review these sorts of recommendations. The state legislature does not. And I think we will wind up with recommendations that could actually put really large numbers of people at risk if we don't run recommendations through the national standard setting body.
Thank you, Melanie. And right now what I'm hearing, because Jen had supported Rep. Ortiz's idea, Melanie has now offered, whether we call it a competing or a parallel idea of what that process can be. We can certainly go to stakeholders with both ideas. Melanie and Representative Ortiz, if we go forward with these, I'm going to want to work with you to make sure we provide some really plain language explanation of what you're both offering if we're going to seek stakeholder input. But Rep. Ortiz, let me bring you back in.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about the language in the contracts that I'm offering is that it's not specifying engineering requirements. It is putting in the contract that they will, as much as possible, take that into consideration. They're not mutually exclusive. So I want to point that out to the subcommittee. Saying that, oh, we have to put it through, first of all, without evidence stating that designing for safety to the exclusion of people with disabilities, and we can't do it any other way, is not what this task force is about. Full stop. Just end it right there. Because you brought no evidence of that, Melanie. And I'm tired of, oh, well, it's going to threaten. We're here to save kids' lives. We can do both, because it's not about the dump. I know the dump is about saving kids' lives. My monoski rig can fit there. The issue is that the part of the ski that holds everything in place gets caught on the front bar. And there is an easy way, either through the product itself, the monoski itself, or through the lift itself, that could solve that without changing the dimensions of the chair. Okay, so I want to make that very clear, that making statements like that is counterproductive to what the task force is here for. I did not outline engineering specifics. What I did state is that to create the expectations that these lifts must also consider adaptive skiers, I don't have control over their engineers. As a state, what I could have control is mandating that you, in your contracts, make that general statement so that the lifts must consider it. I'm not telling them how to design it. I'm saying that it must be a factor in consideration. So I want to make that very clear on separating and saying that my recommendation is not in contrast. And then also don't let counter recommendations on this task force make it sound like, oh, because we designed for people with disabilities, that we're then increasing the liability or make it more unsafe for children or other users. That is not okay, especially without evidence. That's not what we're here for.
Thank you, Rep. Ortiz. And I just want to reiterate, today we're not going to be voting on recommendations, but we want a solid and full airing of potential ideas. And we're going to be asking stakeholders for what their concerns or their responses are to those. So I do want members to feel free to continue respectfully sharing your thoughts and building on the thoughts that you're hearing. Let me go to Jen and then Sharon.
I agree with Representative Ortiz about having the safety of the lifts themselves, whether how we go about making those safer, I don't know, but definitely having that wording in there, I think is good. I mean, it's frightening to me every time I see my daughter getting loaded onto one of the skiers, especially the old lifts that are just two with the pommel in the middle. It doesn't even have a bar or anything over at them. I mean, it's just frightening. So there's the safety of her is not being taken care of at all in some places. So I think that the safety part of it definitely needs to be in our conversation and our recommendations. I mean, I actually just bought her a bi-ski from France because it has the way that it opens up that he was talking about, and then it goes on to the chair itself. A single person can do that because of the way the hydraulics and stuff are in it. So, I mean, I think the manufacturers of equipment also need to be responsible, but that's not something that we can, that's part of this discussion. But yeah, the safety has got to be in there somehow.
Thank you, Jen. Let me go to Sharon and then Melanie.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly follow up. Like, I do agree that it should probably be written into contracts and information the same way. I believe it's kind of an evolution of a sport. I don't think it's taking away safety from others the same way we start including other equipment, whether it's snowboards, adaptive equipment, whatever else comes or shows up on the mountain these days. Equipment's changing. We do have to evolve with that. And just from an engineering perspective, a lot of times you are going to build what is requested of you. So if you start making those recommendations, then that's the best way to get somewhere.
Melanie?
I'm going to make a recommendation that's part of a package with these other recommendations on lifts or a concept. And that is that adaptive equipment that is to be loaded on lifts needs to be standardized. And we need to adopt a standard for adaptive equipment so that lift engineers know what they're designing to, because we're asking the impossible if they're to design for independent use of every single type of equipment that anyone could possibly come up with. I think this is going to come up in the context of trail design and other places in our discussion, if we're going to go there, I think we've got to have some sort of understanding on the part of providers of what they're designing for.
Melanie, I want to probe a little bit, and I see Rep Ortiz's hand up. I'm going to get you in. I'm also, Sharona, as an athlete, I'm going to bring you into this. I hear you raising the question of, should we require the manufacturers of all adaptive equipment to have a common connection point or dimensions or some facet that would work with the lifts? I want to make sure that I'm understanding that and what we're putting out to the table, and if there are variations people want to put there, because I'm wondering, is it the equipment itself? Is it the connection mechanism or device? And forgive me for not, because I don't use this type of equipment. To me, I'm thinking like a standard trailer hitch and trailer ball have become standards, whether it's a 1 1/4 or a 2-inch ball to pull different trailers and things. Are you suggesting the equipment itself needs to be manufactured a specific way, or the ability of that equipment to have a connection point to the lift? And let me get Melanie and then Rep Ortiz and then Sharona on this question of how we address the equipment connection to the lift.
Yeah, I think it's primarily the latter, Barrick. The conversation is not, or the implementation of this idea is an incredibly complicated proposition. And I think if we're going to require that lifts do certain things for folks using adaptive equipment, there has to be some sort of standard to what that equipment, how that equipment performs in terms of loading and unloading lifts, so that can be accomplished.
Thank you. Rep Ortiz.
So just to start off the top, the monoski and biskis, all those equipment are already designed to standards. Because up to this point, up until these new iterations of lifts that I've been seeing the past 4 years, we have had no issues independently loading and unloading. So like, first of all, let's not act like monoski, bikes like that these manufacturers aren't designing to specifications. They are, because of our disability and because of the balance points. And even when you get them, the adjustments that you make are very small based on seating, based on how you set the binding, but they are designed to standards. The issue is, the problem is, we got to identify the problem before we can identify solutions, is one, the chair manufacturers are not being asked or required or requested to be designed to, as much as possible, to the standards that already exist for that equipment. That's problem number one. Problem number two, even if they were open to that, the next problem becomes, how do we standardize either resorts doing it or adaptive sports equipment or the manufacturers of the equipment itself? How do we create a streamlined process for those manufacturers to then get that information to the chairlift companies? That is the next problem that would need to be solved there. So just, again, I live in the adaptive sport. I am not a Paralympian and I'm not a manufacturer of chairs, but I know enough to know that they are already designed to standards. To say that standards don't exist for adaptive sports equipment is not true. They exist. The problem is making sure that the information gets where it needs to get to, and making sure that the manufacturers of lifts, trail openings, whatever, understand what those standards is, and there's a streamlined, efficient way to get them that information.
Representative Ortiz, I want to try to tease out if there's things that we see specifically as the role of the state. And I want to make sure I'm hearing from you, and I'm probably going to need you to help me fill in some lines here. But would the role of the state be to require manufacturers who sell and place in Colorado that they make those work with the most common industry standard adaptive equipment? And do we also separately want to create a state supported mechanism for sharing and warehousing the information about that equipment?
So I think the most efficient way to share that information would be piggybacking off Melanie's idea and require that manufacturers in Colorado, at least, of this adaptive ski equipment must get that information to B77 board. They are the repository. There's already an entity that exists. Let's utilize that. And that way ski lift companies can go to that board to then retrieve that information, right? So we're already utilizing something that's in place. We're not costing the state more money. What we're doing is giving them more, they already have relevance, giving them more relevance when it comes to being the way to streamline and be the bridge between those that manufacture adaptive equipment and those that are trying to design to it. So, but I would say, I would still want to keep my separate recommendation of putting that mandate on resorts, that any contract that they have with ski manufacturers on top of whatever else they want to put in there. Again, this is, if you want to talk about child safety, great, like they can do that. As per this task force, I want to make sure that as much that, and it can say as much as possible, that they design to allow people with disabilities that have adaptive equipment to safely and independently utilize as much as possible ski lifts.
Thank you for helping me clarify that. And we've got several ideas on the table, including the package from Melanie. Rep Ortiz has helped me clarify what that state requirement would be. We're talking about having the equipment manufacturers share that information with the committee that already exists, and the requirement be that to the maximum extent, and we'll let legislators figure out the language, whether it's maximum extent commercially reasonable, but the maximum extent possible, the equipment work with that. Do I have a member of the subcommittee who wants to take Rep Ortiz's idea and suggest that we socialize that? Sharon, I see your hand. Thank you very much. So we will include that in our ideas. In a minute or two, I'm going to move us to other aspects of the ski resort, whether that's lodges, whether that's access to information about the runs themselves, and again, summer or winter. Is there anything before I go there, though, that folks want to offer related specifically to the lifts? Madison, what are you thinking about?
Can we require lift operators to be trained in the safe handling of adaptive ski equipment? Like, could that be a
Ortiz, I don't see
recommendation?
any reason that the state couldn't require something under their regulatory framework.
I would need to get clarification from Melanie, and maybe she needs to get clarification from individual mountains. My understanding in my conversations with adaptive sports programs is that they offer lifties training. Now, the problem with that is I don't know if there's any certification that lifties get. I don't know like what accountability or transparency there is there. Like I can't speak to that, but what I can speak to is I know that there are adaptive sports programs that do offer training for the lifties when it comes to how to handle and like, and most of the time the lifties are, I will speak for myself. I like anecdotally, most of the time as you get in the season, the beginning of the season can be rough, but when you get into it, especially mountains that have adaptive sports programs, they are great. Not every time. Sometimes they don't pay attention. So again, I don't know. Maybe it's more about like officiating or streamlining that training and creating certification around it. And then also it might be a fact of like, how do we then promote transparency and accountability around that type of training? And I would defer to Melanie on offering ideas there, because I would need more clarity on what exists, and then also what would be most mutually beneficial, efficient, effective. So like I pass the ball over to Melanie.
Melanie, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm not completely prepared to answer that question in detail, but the lift attendants are not responsible for equipment.
That's not what we're saying. They're responsible for controlling the speeds and stuff, right? Like they are responsible for what they're responsible for. I'm not asking for additional responsibility here, Melanie, but there are commands that you can use as an able-bodied person that also work for disabled skiers that they're not always on the ball for, that they're not always on top of it for. Not to mention another request that they get trained on is a pullback, which they do for kids too. So we're not asking for anything separate that they don't offer for able-bodied individuals. We are asking, but like for some reason, it's hit or miss sometimes. Usually when we get in the heart of the season, they know exactly what they're doing. And I think with Madison, don't let me put words in your mouth if I'm not, see, it's just, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Melanie.
No, No, I was just going to say, I think they're all trained. There's no question that there's considerable training. As I mentioned earlier, the lift attendants are loading folks every 6 seconds on whatever the length of their shift is, and they're trained for all sorts of different scenarios that arise. I don't think we're going to be able to legislate that is perfectly handled by every person every single time that somebody loads a lift in the state of Colorado. Everybody's a human being out there, and that's a complicated
Is
proposition.
is there a current cert that they get, or like when they go through the lifty training, is there like someone that a leader signs off on, like you are now trained, and like the generic?
There's all sorts, yes, they
Okay,
are
so
trained and they're retrained throughout, and they've got regular updates to their training throughout the season.
so this would be my question, I think, for you, Melanie, is there a part of that training that is required around adaptive? Because there's a training for kids, I'm sure, adults, emergency procedures. Is there a specific vignette for skiers with disabilities? That would be my first question. If there's not, then I think what Madison is asking for is that there is something official within the training that covers skiers with disabilities, just in the same way that I'm sure there's a portion of the training that covers kids.
I think there is, but I'm not sure exactly where to point you. But I'm
Who-
pretty sure there is. We can look into that.
Yeah,
Okay.
let me do this. Melanie, let me get with you and see what is required. Madison, what I'm hearing from you is if it's not required, should the state require that lift operators, and by that we mean the ski venues, include a training module for their lifties on supporting and assisting athletes with disabilities? Is that what I'm
Yes,
hearing from you, Madison?
as part of the existing certification process to be a lifty.
And the way we have to word that, Barrick, is we're not asking for anything additional, because as soon as you ask Ski Country for anything additional, they lose their mind. You have to say, just as you do the same thing with kids, and we are asking that you are trained on the commands that everyone gets, whether it's a pullback like you do with kids, whether it's a slow, a full stop, full speed up top, whatever, that they also get trained on those commands as it pertains to skiers with disabilities, just like they do with kids.
Got it. And thank you for helping me with that. Let me go to Sharon, and then I want to move the conversation beyond lifts to other things, although I'll continue to solicit ideas.
Yeah, I heard a couple of comments like saying that, it's impossible or it's going to be hard to reach, but I think a couple of these things are actually pretty easy. It's just modifying language and making sure we're aware of the issue, whether it's adding adaptive equipment or people with disabilities to contract language, or also adding the language within training to make sure that we notice someone that's using adaptive equipment to make sure we are safely loading and unloading passengers is not an additional ask. It's just writing it in language and setting a new floor for us to recognize that population and make sure that we're thinking of people with disabilities or adaptive equipment when we're building something or doing training. I don't think that's a big ask. And we're not like that, like Dave, our Representative Ortiz said, there's no ask for really changing anything. It's just kind of bringing awareness to those points.
I appreciate you highlighting that, Sharon. If folks have additional thoughts on lifts, I'll invite you to raise them as we continue. We are down to about 25 minutes. We've covered a number of ideas, and as I know Carrie is taking probably 50 or 60 pages of notes already. As I said at the very top of the call, what we will be doing is taking and cleaning up the ideas you've generated, from the accessible parking to the requirement of shuttle service if it's offsite, to the possibility of the adaptive athlete parking. We've talked with some very specific ideas of what we're going to require around lifts or socialize with stakeholders about. I want to move past the lift and now on to the mountain, and ask if there are ideas that you want to put on the table when it comes to enjoying the mountain itself, whether that's the trails, the knowledge of it, or other aspects. Mr. Ortiz.
So in my experience, I don't know if they're required to do this or if they already do this. So again, this would be another question for Melanie on the resort. So like, those restaurants that are actually on the mountain, right? When I ask, they tend to have like a temporary chair, like a medical chair. So I don't know if that's something that's required or not. If it's not, I would be interested in making that a requirement at every one of those places, that they have one that is fully functional, has foot plates, etc. That if someone with a disability wants to use, they can. Again, like, and that, like, putting no extra liability on Ski Country. It's that person. Once they see the chair that the restaurant is offering, then that is their decision whether they want to transfer out of their chair to use it to be able to share a meal with their friends or not, or to be able to use the bathroom. So, and then also just making sure that we're enforcing ADA bathroom requirements on those restaurants that are on the mountain as well because of it, right? So just making sure that we are creating equity around that. As far as the mountain goes, like, my experience with Ski Patrol has been almost always really good. It has been my experience that they understand the safety issues, they understand the equipment, they understand evacuating. And outside of that, unless I'm missing a spot, team or Melanie, I don't understand what other responsibilities there would be while you're on the mountain necessarily, besides evacuation. Just like it's every skier's individual responsibility to get themselves down unless a case of emergency. I kind of feel that way about adaptive skiers as well.
Thank you.
The only other area that and I feel uncomfortable making requirements or asking, or maybe you all don't, but I feel uncomfortable making asks about this, would be like those rope lifts, right? You know, that leg walkers use to get to certain parts of the mountain. What the state could require or fund and ask for is a task force that brings together adaptive ski equipment manufacturers, that brings together adaptive sports programs, and brings together maybe the members of the ANSI board to discuss ways that adaptive skiers can adapt the equipment and procedures to making that accessible if possible. But like that, you know, a task force is at least investigating it and seeing what the feasibility is. Because again, like when we talk about ADA, it's reasonable accommodation. There are just some parts of the mountain that you're not going to be able to get to, right? That's just, you know, where it would require billions of dollars in an act of God, right? Like, just saying, like, but that's something that can still be explored. Maybe the equipment can be adjusted in a way, or maybe there's a procedure. Like, that's why I say for those parts of the mountain, maybe it could be a task force in the future. But outside of that, like, I know that Ski Patrol is really trained. And outside of the restaurants or the warm-up huts, like, I just don't see anything else. But that's just me, unless I'm missing something.
Thanks, Rep. Jen, you've got your hand up.
This might be a good part of the discussion to move a bit beyond the mobility issues that are faced with ski areas, but also to folks who might be blind or low vision, people that have had loss of hearing. How do they access the mountain? How do they know what run they're going to? And sure, maybe they do have someone with them, but how can we make the mountains more accessible to other users as well?
And Jen, you've got to know that the next thing I'm going to do is ask you if you have specific ideas. Are we talking about accessible, whether it's audible or braille or other forms of trail maps and digital information availability? What are you thinking the state might want to require, or a role the state might want to take that we could socialize with stakeholders to get at that point of that universal accessibility?
Well, just off the top of my head, I think using, you know, audio types of apps of the ski area that could explain and narrate what the terrain is, what the different access points are. Yeah, maybe having braille ski maps for, you know, where people are going. I mean, I have a couple friends just in our area over here that blind and low vision that would love to have more access to be able to be more independent. And I'm not an expert on that. That was just, you know, and even maybe, you know, like in the traffic signs when you're crossing the street at a crossroad, you know, and it says it's safe to walk, it's safe to walk. You put something, you don't want it to be this big, huge blaring horn of things, but there could be a way that people could access, you know, here is the green run, you know, maybe something like that. I don't know, but I really think technology would be a huge part of that. And whether there be an app that they would access through each individual ski area could be really cool.
And just as a reminder, as I get ready to bring Rep Ortiz in, right now we're really focused on roles of the state, things the state can do, require, enforce, or oversee. There's also going to be room as we continue in the months ahead for best practices and programs that you think should be in place. I'm not trying to influence what you put into any of these categories, just to remind folks we're kind of focused on where that hand of the state can play, but there's going to be room for others. Rep. Ortiz. You're muted, sir.
Thanks for that, Jen, because that got my mind moving. I think what the state can do is require the infrastructure of the resort to be accessible for people that are visually impaired in the same way we do our cities, right? Like crosswalks, because like first of all, people that are blind can ski with a guide. So, but like they might have to get to the adaptive sport program on their own independently to get to their guide. So that's why it might be like, so what the state could do is require the same standards of ADA that exist in your cities already when it comes to crosswalks, et cetera, to the ski resorts. There's a technology that we're mandating for the airport. It's called wayfinding technology, where an individual that is visibly impaired can independently navigate the airport. So we can require something like that for the resorts as well. I think making sure that the websites that have the map, the ski map itself on it, because there's something to be said about prep work, even if you are going to be dependent on a guide, at least then the individual blind skier might be able to come up with a plan if the map that's online is also accessible for them, right? So they know where the black runs are, they know where the blue runs are, they know what the name of the lifts are to get them there. So they can kind of create a plan in their head before they get there. So I think requiring maps that are available online to everybody, or the websites in general, to be accessible for people that are visually impaired, which we've already done in 1110 for the state and all levels of government, right? Like those are things that the state can require when it comes to that. But my understanding is that a visually impaired skier is not going to be on the mountain without their guide. That's a safety issue that just, that's like me trying to be on the mountain without my mono ski rig. It's not going to happen.
So again, this is me neither advocating nor intending to ask leading questions, but listening to what Jen has offered and listening to what Rep. Ortiz just shared, is there anyone who would like to suggest that one of the ideas, again, it's not a recommendation yet, it's an idea to socialize with stakeholders, that among those ideas be that there be information available in all maps, whether online or printed, about those accessibility and some of the technologies and approaches he mentioned, like 1110 for government, around accessibility and wayfinding. Rep. Ortiz, is your hand back up or was it still up? Okay. Is there anybody who would like to suggest those ideas be on our list of ideas to get feedback from? And Curtis, I see your hand up. I'm going to go to you and then to John.
No, I was going to say I would recommend yes.
Then you have been heard and Carrie has captured. Those are on our list to get stakeholder input on. John, to you.
Yeah, I agree with that part about the limitation that we made for blind skiers and hearing impaired skiers. Well, we're blind skiers. I would recommend that the information that we're writing to those athletes be presented in a way that not only accessible to them, but also available to them. So like it's not enough to have like specialized formats that only certain people can find. What do you know? The question that I have is, one, how do we do that? Because if we're gonna do it online, there are a lot of barriers with the internet and using a computer itself that we may not be appreciative of as people who can see. And I know there are for sure different programs that visually impaired people could have to access that. I think we should be mindful about the way technology interacts with with the annotated.
John, I appreciate the thoughts and the reminder on that caution. I'm going to guess Rep Ortiz has some thoughts. Just before I bring you in, Rep, I need to note it's 4:16. According to the agenda, I would be going to public comment now. If you're watching the YouTube, if you're listening while you drive, I am not going to public comment right now because we've had no requests for public comment. If you are in the Zoom and you'd like to address the group, drop a message in the chat. This is the only time I'll ask that to me, Barrick Abramson, and we'll get you on. Rep Ortiz, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, John, for just making sure that we are taking that we are representing or trying to represent those communities and not just speaking for them. So there are already standards that exist that this community agrees to and supports. Wayfinding technology is one of them. So when I'm saying wayfinding, that's not for me. I didn't learn about that on my own because of my disability. Like I learned about that because of people that are actually visually impaired want that and ask for that, right? So if I'm talking about the standards that exist, it's about the standards that they set in place. We're talking about web access. There is an international standard that 1110 was set to, that the DOJ just made a decision, by the way, just want to call that out to everyone too, is set to, and it's called WCAG. It's an international standard on how to make websites accessible. And there are companies and programs out there that help people either put systems or software in place so that their product is accessible at the very beginning. So appreciate the concern. We should always take those concerns into consideration. There are standards and there are companies and there are programs out there that exist to make sure we're building to that standard.
Thanks, Rep. We've got about 7 more minutes for this discussion. Then I need to go over some next steps and confirm some scheduling issues that I'll carry Lean in on. I do want to open the conversation and we can continue this the next time as needed. We've talked about parking, we've talked about access, we've talked about getting up the mountain, we've talked about getting around the mountain. I want to open up the conversation about facilities, structures, and buildings on the ski grounds, whether that's lodges, stores, restrooms, or other facilities, and ask if there's things that folks want to put on the table here. Rep Ortiz. Muted, sir.
Act like I've been there before. Sorry about that, guys. So there's something that needs to be discussed around possibly creating mandates around accessible bathrooms. Because, for example, Winter Park, it has one. And if the NSCD office is closed, if the NSCD office was closed when the elevator was broken, and apparently the elevator had been broken for 2 weeks to the only accessible bathroom, then maybe creating mandates where if a resort only has one accessible bathroom and there's only one elevator to reach that accessible bathroom, then it must be worked on, reopened within X amount of days within their, whatever is within their power to get it repaired, or they're liable, right? Like there needs to be either some type of incentive for them to build or make their bathrooms accessible, because there's bathrooms across the way, but the doors are too narrow and there's no accessible stalls in there, right? So we need to create some type of incentive where they're creating more than one accessible bathroom, and it would be especially better if the accessible bathroom wasn't reached, didn't need an elevator to be reached by, right? So like whatever the standard floor is, talk them into start designing that way. That way, if the elevator breaks, then at least a person can still have the basic dignity of using the restroom, right? So like that's something that needs to be considered as well.
Thank you. So let me open that one up to the group, and I'm glad you raised it. It was one that I had heard you mention and want to make sure we discuss. Do any members want to offer something specific about either the number of, the location of, or the obligation to fix and repair in the event of damage accessible bathrooms? Jen.
Sorry, I feel like I'm just putting way too much into this conversation, but it's very passionate to me because it's part of my life. And I sent Barrick a video after showing my daughter being carried downstairs in her manual chair during 2 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken to get to the bathroom that she needed to use. And my point is, maybe, I don't know what the rules are about elevators in public areas, but a lot of that I've seen, especially at the smaller resorts, are like cargo lifts. They're not really elevators. I mean, they elevate product, but they need to be safer and, just better to give people, like Rep was saying about dignity, that they don't have to go on a cargo elevator to get to the bathroom. So I don't know what kind of standards those are, but I think that's one of the biggest things I've seen, especially in these smaller ski areas, that the elevator situation needs to definitely be addressed.
So I'm going to keep poking people and probing because it's not my role to take a theoretical and develop an idea to socialize. I can prompt all of you. I can see where you could consider any one of a number of things, from if there's only one accessible bathroom, it must not require reaching it by elevator. Or you could go the direction Rep Ortiz said of, if it requires elevator access and that elevator goes down, it must have a top priority repair order and be repaired within, I don't know if you want to say 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, or there must in all cases be an accessible bathroom available that does not require the use of an elevator or other means of ingress or egress. I'm not proposing any of these. I'm throwing out a bunch of things for you to consider, giving me a very specific idea that you want to socialize. Rep Ortiz.
Yeah, and it could be a combination, right? Like if they have multiple bathrooms that, so say one's accessible by a lift, but they have another one that's not, and the lift goes down, then maybe it wouldn't apply in that case, right? Like what we want to try, what I feel like we should try and do is create teeth and enforcement, yes, but create incentive for these places to be doing the right things for themselves anyways, right? Like if we can get a bathroom on a ground floor where we don't need an elevator at all, like that is less maintenance for them, right? That is less things for them to worry about. That is easier for us as people with disabilities to use, right? Like it is. So, but if they don't want to do that, then we sure as heck better make sure that like they at least have one lift. If they choose to have two methods of getting to that bathroom that are accessible, great. That could cover it, right? If the lift breaks, but you have another accessible means, and carrying us is not an accessible means for us to get to that bathroom, then great. And if they only have one means and the elevator is the only means and that is the only accessible bathroom, well, then it must be repaired within X amount of hours, right? So kind of creating a system where you make allowances for people trying to do the right thing, but also mandate doing the right thing as a floor. So
I'll invite anybody to weigh in. I will also offer that Carrie and I will take the recording of this discussion and we can put together kind of this scaffolded option of incentives and expectations similar to what has been discussed. Does anybody want to offer specifics or elements you'd like to see in that? And Melanie, I apologize, I am going to call on you as someone that is on the operational side of this, if you have thoughts of what this could look like.
Well, my initial thinking is, this is a great conversation when you're talking about renovation and new buildings. It's an entirely different conversation when you're talking about buildings that have been in place for 25 or 30 years or longer in some cases. So I would urge us to factor that into the discussion as well. I think generally speaking, this is an area where ski areas have do try, and in fact, in most cases are doing the right thing. And elevators don't always work. And that's not an excuse. I think that's reality, and I hear what you're saying.
Thank you, Melanie. And it may be that this group ends up developing a set of recommendations that's around any remodel, renovation, and one that's around new construction, and one that has a phase in of existing. And that's not, again, me proposing it, it's just me articulating what could be approaches. I want to get Curtis, you had your hand up first. So let me get to Curtis and then to you, Rep Ortiz.
I think the elevator issue, it's more than the bathroom. My previous job, I used to take groups of 30, 40 kids to that ski resort. They would deny me the right for me to do my job, to ensure the safety of those kids, because we had to take those kids upstairs to eat and to do all those things. So it's not just the bathroom issue. That elevator some kind of, some, I don't know, legislation, whatever, but it's a problem in other industries too, getting elevators fixed, and that is a problem too, but something that needs to be visited somewhere somehow. I know apartment complexes are happening all over, that people are getting stuck because of that, and it may be the elevator industry that we need to address.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Rep Ortiz, you're going to get the final thoughts here, and then I'm going to do some next steps and close up.
And this is just, again, a teachable moment. Not trying to go too hard on anybody, but like buildings that are 30 years old, or even if they're 100 years old, that is no longer an excuse. It cannot be used as an excuse. And here's why I say that. Does anybody know what Fort William Henry is? What its historical significance is? Any ideas? No. Okay. It was around during the French and Indian War. It was built in 1755. And I was there over this winter visiting my wife, because that's where she's from. It's from upstate New York, where Fort William Henry is. There was an elevator that allowed me to get to the ramparts. They made the ramparts accessible. They installed an elevator. That entire place has an accessible bathroom. This idea or this excuse that buildings are old and it is hard is just that. It is an excuse, especially with how much money ski country takes in and what's available. If a historic site like Fort William Henry that was built in 1755 can make their ramparts accessible, can install an elevator that works reliably there, then there's no reason that ski country cannot secure the same thing. Okay, like again, to educate community out there living with a disability is that we have to start fighting for our basic access and stop listening to the same tired sound bites when there's examples out there of places that really have no business doing it that are doing it right, and buildings that are 200 and something, 300 years old, right? So, I'm not saying it has to happen overnight, but please don't allow people to say, well, they're old, so this is the best we can do. The conversation needs to be, okay, we get that they're old. This is still the goal. How do we get there together?
So I am going to move us. Melanie, I'm going to give you a second if you'd like to respond. Curtis, I'm going to give you like a lightning round because I've got 2 minutes and I've got to close this out with some next steps. I do want to emphasize Melanie is here as a representative of the ski industry. We also have plenty of other resorts that operate here in Colorado. And so what we talk about is not going to be just about one of those operators. It's going to be about all of those operators that serve Colorado. But Melanie, since there was some back and forth there, I don't want to turn this into a debate, but I do want to give you a minute if you'd like it.
I think it's better that I not say anything else right now.
That's fine. Curtis.
I just have to throw in, I rode an elevator up the Acropolis in 2004, and the Acropolis is old.
A little older.
Thousands, yeah. So
let me do this. We're down to 2 minutes. One, I want to thank everybody for an extremely robust conversation. Going into this, I know we had so many learning conversations. I'm really excited about the number of very specific ideas that were generated, from the shuttle to the adaptive athlete designation that may become part of passes, to the parking, the access, the conversation about the requirements on the lifts and the manufacturers, to talking about elevators and bathrooms and digital accessibility to information. We had interviewed or surveyed everyone about trying to get an in-person or a hybrid retreat together. I will be very transparent. It has been very difficult to find 4 hours that work for everyone. And I acknowledge that asking 4 hours in person is more like asking 6 hours by the time you commute, which really means I'm asking for a full day away. That's been difficult. What we're doing with some of the other subcommittees in lieu of that is doing 2 2-hour meetings in July. So we're taking the scheduled meeting that is 90 minutes, we're tacking another 30 minutes onto it, and we're working with members to find a second 2-hour block. So we still get those 4 hours. I still believe it's really important we find that kind of time to thoughtfully work through these issues. So if I can get a show of hands, does adding 30 minutes to our existing call and finding a second opportunity for a 2-hour call, is that a reasonable path rather than the 4-hour in person? I'm seeing digital hands. I'm seeing some real hands. I'm going to ask Carrie to go ahead and reach out to folks and try to find that second day. I would love to spend that 4 hours together and really workshop some things around the table. I just recognize you all are giving so much time already that's going to be very difficult to do. It's 4:31. I know we had the Lieutenant Governor on earlier. She was doing a lot of catch up after being very busy. Rep Ortiz, I want to thank you. I'm going to give you 30, 60 seconds for final thoughts for this group.
No, just want to thank everybody for the commitment of their time and effort. Just keep focused on what the purpose of this task force is. I appreciate the work that you guys are going to do. Don't be afraid to make any recommendation. Don't be afraid to challenge each other and push back. Let's keep it respectful, though. Really appreciate the work and the volunteering.
Thank you all. As I said, we'll clean up these ideas and get them in a Google Doc that you'll all be able to comment. I'll also send them as a Word doc in case Google is any kind of a challenge for folks, which I know it can be at times. We'll get that out over the next 2 weeks so that we can work with all of you to start getting it out to stakeholders. Otherwise, we'll follow up about scheduling and extending those meetings. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you.